My name is Drew Waldron, and I am on with New York Times bestselling author and one of the nation's most prominent scholars, Dr. Eddie Glaude. Eddie, it's great to sit down with you. How are you?
I'm doing well, Drew. How are you?
I'm fantastic, and I've been looking forward to this interview, so I'm glad we're finally sitting down. I want to start it off by asking, your professional life is so deeply layered. You're an author, you're an educator, political analyst, and the list goes on and on. In your own words, how would you introduce your career?
Wow, I mean, it's an interesting question, and it's kind of bound up with someone who fell in love with the life of the mind, right? What does it mean to have ideas move you at the level of the soul? And so, it's this combination of wanting to think seriously about issues that animate me, that move me, wanting to put my thoughts on the page, wanting to have impact on how the country thinks about itself, to think about matters, and to do that over time as I've aged. It's one thing to love books and to love to read and to love to talk and to run your mouth, as it were. It's another thing to become a junior professor, after going through graduate school. It's another thing to be a senior professor and then to have a kind of public presence. But I think the through line and how I would introduce my career would be, this is a fellow who just simply loves to think and is seduced by the power of ideas, and trying in the short time that he's here to lend some clarity to the human journey in this particular place called the United States.
That is admirable. And I think that it's clear that the topics you're drawn to are so deeply human, from religion to race to philosophy. What do you think it was that led a young Eddie Glaude into becoming a cultural scholar? What set you on the path that you're on now?
It's all deeply personal. And I think it has everything to do with questions I had as a young man growing up on the coast of Mississippi. My parents were working class folk. My dad was a postman, and my mother worked at the shipyard in Pascagoula, Mississippi. I grew up in Moss Point. And there were just these questions about identity. Who did I take myself to be? Questions about history. What do I do with the fact that I'm Black and Southern and raised Catholic, right? How does that make sense? How can I make sense of that, right? In the context of the political and social realities of my childhood. And so there's the question of identity. Who do I take myself to be? The question of history. From whence do I come, right? From what is the history that shapes and informs how I answer the first question. And then the last preoccupation is with, what can I do, right? Who am I? From where do I come? And what can I do? So that's identity, history, and agency. And so those three things, I think, preoccupied me from a very young age. And they kind of deepened while I was at Morehouse College in Atlanta, the alma mater of Martin Luther King Jr., and gave me a sense of how to think about those questions beyond my own hangups, my own attempts to become the man that I think God has called me to be, and to think about those questions in a broader context. And then to do that in concert with, my love of reading, my love of ideas and the like. So I think what set me on this journey as a scholar concerned about the public domain, are all of these deeply personal questions, right, that continue to animate my work and serve as the source of attraction that I have to certain scholars as opposed to others, to certain writers or thinkers as opposed to others. Yeah.
Those three factors that you mentioned, history, agency, and identity, in your work as a political analyst, I'd imagine that you have to be constantly cued in to the news, constantly cued in to what's happening. How do you apply those ideas to current events whenever you're called in for an interview on the news?
It's a big challenge, to be honest with you. And I think part of the challenge is trying to figure out how to bring the full weight of my bibliography, all the things that I've been reading over the course of a life as a scholar, as an intellectual. How do I bring that bibliography to bear on an issue within the confines and limitations of a soundbite? Contemporary punditry doesn't lend itself to long form. So I can't sit there and unwind an idea. And so I think the challenge is how do I bring my concerns, the things that animate me, the things that matter most to me, to bear on the subject in front of us? So if we're talking, for example, I did a show on Morning Joe, and they were talking about Taylor Swift and the tight end of the Kansas City Chiefs. I think it's Travis Kelce, right? And they were talking about about the Republican conspiracy theories around the couple. And I was just kind of taken aback by it. And the reason I was taken aback by it was because it's like, is this what we're talking about in this moment when it seems as if democracy, right, is threatened, or the very foundations of the republic are under assault? And I'm talking about a pop star and a football player. And you know what happened? I found myself saying, oh, wow, this is exactly what Walter Lippmann was worrying about in 1922 with mass consumer culture, that people would become so preoccupied with their lives and the minutiae that they wouldn't have the ability to think and reason in a very sophisticated and nuanced way about the problems they face. Now, I disagree with Lippmann, but I was like, oh, this is where we are. And look at me, I'm in this moment. And so I found myself drawing on that as I was trying to respond in the moment, you know? So I think the challenge has always been, how do I shift the frame in light of the concerns that drive my work? How do I get the questions asked that force us to go deeper in relation to the issues faced, and how to do that within the limitations of television, right? Or the structure of a soundbite, if that makes sense.
I could see how it could be difficult to, make a very intelligent point in a 30-second soundbite when you can go on and on about the subject for half an hour, 2 hours,
Ex-
however long. It's interesting that you just were asked about the Taylor Swift conspiracy on the news. I'm wondering, since you were just talking about that other point, what relationship do you think that the American public currently has with sensationalism and celebrity, and how important it's become, like you just said, this distracting manner?
Well, I think it's one of the dangers of mass consumer culture. You know, it's almost as if with social media platforms these days, each of us can become our own micro reality show. We can produce brand. We can actually become preoccupied with a certain standing within consumer culture. And celebrities are these larger than life figures that serve as either inspiration or aspiration, right? They inspire us to live our lives in particular sorts of ways, or we aspire to be celebrities of sorts. And in some ways, it could be a kind of distorting influence. It doesn't necessarily have to be, but it can be a distorting influence where we look outside of ourselves, we outsource responsibility, or we place value on the surface of things, you know, not on the substance of things, where image becomes much more important than who we are on the inside. And so I think one of the challenges we've always faced as kind of mass consumer culture has overrun American society for so long is, how do we protect seriousness in the midst of it all? How do we ensure a level of gravitas, even as we laugh at ourselves, that we don't take ourselves too seriously, but we also must have a degree of gravitas if we're going to deal with the issues that confront us. So it is, I don't want to scapegoat celebrity and say that's the only problem we have, but it is a reflection of a kind of culture that urges you and me, us, to live on the surface of things and not to go deeper and to tap the root of what's actually motivating our behavior and our choices.
Absolutely. It is an image obsessed culture. To move on to a different topic,
Sure.
one of your recent MSNBC appearances that I really enjoyed was when you came on as a political analyst to discuss Claudine Gay's situation at Harvard
Mm-hmm.
and just give your thoughts. You stated your perspective on the notion that higher education politically indoctrinates their students, and you stated that that's an argument that has continuously evolved over the last half century from opposing political forces. In your opinion, why have universities been getting this type of blame decade after decade?
Well, you know, it has everything to do with the student movements of the mid 20th century, right? It has everything to do with the free speech movements at Berkeley. It has everything to do with, you know, the Black student protests at Cornell and across campuses, you know, 68 in American life, not only after the assassination of Dr. King, where there were over 200 rebellions in cities across the country, but we also saw students protesting across college campuses, demanding access, demanding a shift in curricula and hiring practices and the like. And so there was this kind of overriding assumption that universities and colleges were these bastions of radicalism. Ronald Reagan would even say, why should we publicly fund these places that are producing these students who are lawbreakers, as it were? That's not a quote, but that's the gist of what he was suggesting. And so what we begin to see in that moment is a kind of policy initiative that led to the defunding of public schools. You know, oftentimes we don't want to admit it, but places like the California system and, the UC system, or schools at University of Wisconsin, Madison, or in the CUNY system. These schools were basically free. The tuition wasn't as high as it was. But as we come out of the 60s and we see this shift in how universities are funded. And then in the 80s, of course, with the ascendance of Reaganism, right, he becomes not just simply, he's no longer the governor of California, but the president of the United States, which changes the framework of how we think about education and the like. We get this argument about the nature of what is being taught. Oh my goodness, this Black studies and gender studies, and that the radicals of the 60s have now made their way into the classroom and they're indoctrinating our students with this left-wing orthodoxy. And we saw that with Alan Bloom's work, The Closing of the American Mind, in the 80s. And so all of that stuff has been rebranded in our current moment. Wokeism is just another word for political correctness, right? The free speech has ironically been appropriated from the students who were organizing at Berkeley University, University of California, Berkeley in the 60s, to now becoming a place for viewpoint diversity. So some of the more noxious views about, diversity in the country can be expressed. So I think part of what I was trying to suggest is that there's a long history of this kind of generalization about higher education. Right? That these people who believe that there's a kind of left-wing orthodoxy indoctrinating our students, this is an old argument. And part of what I wanted to do was to defend universities and colleges as the very special places that they are. No other institutional space in the United States offers our students, offers anyone actually, the opportunity to not only engage in a kind of broad exposure to material and books from a wide range of traditions, but people from a wide range of places with different experiences. Universities and colleges are perhaps the best place, Drew, for free and open inquiry, where people can take risks, they can argue and disagree, and do so in the pursuit of truth in some ways, in the pursuit of knowledge. But let me just say this by way of summing up what I was thinking. We are in a moment of increased volatility and vitriol. Our public discourse is bitter, it's mean-spirited, and in the midst of the conflicts around the world, our students are debating and protesting and counter-protesting. And oftentimes people expect them to disagree in ways that the country has forgotten how to disagree. And so in many ways, what we're seeing on our college campuses is a reflection of what we're seeing in the broader public. My aim and effort was and remains to defend the power of universities and colleges. They have their problems, but they're very special places when it comes to producing the kinds of people that democracies really, really need.
I totally understand your passion as someone who has been working in higher education for almost all his professional life, and can't wait to sit down with you in 10 years when it's no longer wokeism, it's the new term. It's the new term that they have a problem. But that's a conversation for a decade from now. I'd love to talk to you about your upcoming book. Your upcoming book is titled "We Are the Leaders We Have Been Looking For." What can your readers expect when it releases in April of 2024?
Well, it's a different sort of book, right? Typically, my readers think of me as a kind of historian or someone who's offering contemporary analysis with deep, thick historical context. But here I'm putting on my philosophical hat. I'm trying to understand, the importance, the significance of everyday ordinary people to the functioning, to the well-being of democracy itself. We find ourselves in a moment where we're in trouble. And I think we're in trouble as a democracy because we've been outsourcing our responsibility for it to others. We think politicians can be responsible for democracy. We think leaders, whatever, of civil rights organizations or civic organizations should be responsible for democracy while we get about our own business, our day-to-day lives, right? Well, in we are the leaders we've been looking for. I'm saying we can't do that anymore. That the American Republic stands on the precipice. That our democracy is in peril. And if it's going to be saved, it's going to be up to us, the demos, everyday ordinary people. And if that's true, and I think about this specifically, Drew, in the context of Black American politics, we can't outsource that responsibility to some Black leader or to some leader more generally. And if we are to assume that responsibility, we have to do the work of becoming better people, right? We have to engage in self-cultivation, as it were, to reach for higher forms of excellence. I learned this lesson from James Baldwin. Baldwin put it this way. He said, and I'm paraphrasing, of course. He says, and it sounds cliche, but I think it's so true, that the messiness of the world is in part a reflection of the messiness of our interior life. And if we're going to build a better world, we have to become better people. So if we are responsible for democracy as such, we also were responsible to reaching for higher excellences, for becoming better people. And so the book explores those two things at once, that we don't need to outsource our responsibility to leaders. We are the prophets we're looking for. We don't need prophets called by God. If we use our imaginations, we can be prophetic in our own work, in our own doing, everyday living. We don't need heroes, right? We don't need the Marvel comic. We don't need the Marvel heroes swooping down on us, saving the day. We need representative human beings, to use Emerson's language. We need representative people who can be heroic in the moment in which they live, in the moment in which they face the problems that threaten their way of life. And we need a conception or an idea of democratic life that affirms the dignity and standing of everyday ordinary people, that democracy is of the people, for the people, and by the people. And to use the language of African American Christendom or American Christendom generally, we need a pew-centered democracy, not a pulpit-centered democracy. We don't need leaders. We need the folk in the pews to take ownership of the direction of the country, as it were.
I sense a link between what you just talked about with outsourcing leadership, outsourcing values, and the conversation that we just had about celebrity culture and outsourcing our image to celebrity. Is that anything that you touch upon in the book?
It's not, I don't specifically talk about celebrities, but I do talk about the way in which heroes can blind us to what we're capable of. So there are three figures that anchor the book.
Hmm.
One is Martin Luther King Jr., one is Malcolm X, and the last is Miss Ella Baker. And these are three of my heroes, going back to the way in which we began our conversation, right? Dealing with who do I take myself to be, grappling with the history that makes me who I am, and asking myself the question, what can I do in a world that has been bequeathed to me, right? And so in the book, I look at these three figures and I say, oh, you get this prophetic voice of Dr. King, but how is it that Dr. King just simply comes to me as a figure that towers over me, as opposed to being an example of how I can use my imagination and be courageous in the moment in which I live, right? Where the prophetic is not something outside of me, where someone is being called by a force outside of our living, but it's actually internal in the very exercise of imagination, or what John Dewey would call dramatic rehearsal, right? Mm-hmm. Malcolm is really important because Malcolm is this figure that I reach for. See, because I'm so wounded, at least I was, I think probably still am. You know, I had this vexed relationship with my father, and Malcolm became this figure that allowed me to express my rage and anger. I have my goatee in some ways as a testament to that conversion experience. And so, but what does it mean to cower before a hero, where the hero is so important, looms so large that, to use Emerson's language, you become like a sack and stomach. You know, you just contain what they have as opposed to what you have. And so I have to break loose from that, right? I don't want to be like these folks. And then, of course, Miss Ella Baker, who was so central to the mid 20th century in terms of Black freedom struggles, from field secretary organizing and the NAACP to first executive secretary of SCLC, of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, to helping organize the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee after the student sit-ins. And in April of 1968, at Shaw University made possible this organization that was so important among young folk. And here she wants to say a strong people doesn't need leaders, because we are the leaders we've been looking for. So yes, celebrities can become those persons in which we outsource responsibility to, right? We seek to imitate them. They overrun our own voices, our own sense of self. No. What I'm trying to argue for, and we are the leaders we've been looking for, is that the prophetic, the heroic or representative, the democratic resides in each of us. That we are the leaders we've been looking for, not Joe Biden, not Donald Trump, not Hakeem Jeffries, not Al Sharpton, not Nancy Pelosi. We are the leaders we've been looking for, and the leaders that democracy desperately, desperately needs.
That is incredibly, incredibly well said. Eddie, as you are traveling the country to all these different speaking engagements, specifically college speaking engagements, do you find that people have different relationships with the ideals that MLK expressed?
Oh, absolutely. They have different views of who Dr. King actually was. A lot of it is kind of focused, of course, around the MLK holiday. And many folk kind of come to him through the lens of the I Have a Dream speech, the March on Washington in 1963. And so the kind of full breadth of Dr. King's witness often gets channeled, kind of, focused in that to that moment. And so people don't really see the arc, the long arc of his life in some sense. And part of what I try to do in those moments is to bring Dr. King down to the ground, to tell stories about, his depression, to bring in the later King, who's talking about the triple evils of militarism and materialism and racism. I'm fond of saying, there's this Q&A that happened at the 68th Rabbinical Conference, and Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel introduced him, and it was during the Q&A, and someone said, well, what can I do to help with the Poor People's Campaign? And Dr. King pauses and he says, well, we have to admit that America is a racist country, that racism still occupies the throne of this nation. And people are like, that's Dr. King? And so the idea is to make them human so that people can see that not only Dr. King, but Malcolm X, Fannie Lou Hamer, these were ordinary people who were called by history, and they just simply answered the call. And when we are called, their heroic effort exemplify or demonstrate that we can be heroic too. Not that we're not like them, that they're godlike and that they're above us, and they exhibit courage in ways that are unfathomable by everyday ordinary people. No. They are human examples of what human beings are capable of, which means what you're capable of. And so the idea is to bring these folk, and particularly the figures of like Dr. King, and for me, because Malcolm and King were so important, to bring them down to the ground so that I don't get lost, right? So I don't disappear, right? And my voice can be found and heard, if that makes sense.
It does feel a little funny to say, but sometimes it could be difficult to remember that these towering figures were humans too. So it's fantastic that you have that process of humanizing MLK, humanizing Malcolm X. If we could turn to speak about your corporate
Sure.
clients instead of your college ones, you've spoken to so many corporate clients seeking your insight on DEI practices. Now that it's 2024 and we've had so many years of companies embracing DEI in their workforce, what do you think are some things that these companies are still missing in the 2024 DEI space? What are they still might understand?
When I enter the DEI space, I do so not as a person who understands corporations and has a business degree, or I enter it to try to get to tap the root, to get beneath the surface. And I think corporations just fundamentally have to understand the difference between diversity as a problem to be managed and diversity as a value to be cherished. Once you shift that orientation, now we're doing something different. See, when diversity is viewed as a problem to be managed, there's an idea of the we that has to manage the other that's demanding inclusion. The we who possesses something that they take or understand to be theirs and theirs alone, and another who's asking for some seat at their table. I want to disrupt that. And, I always use the example of a friend who was part of founding the Lincoln Project, calling me one day, asking me about the project and saying that they were going to do something really big and we're going to invite you to the table. And I started chuckling and I said, how are you going to invite me to my table? Trying to shift the orientation, right? So when diversity is viewed as a problem to be managed, we're thinking about compliance. We're thinking about not getting sued. We're thinking about quotas and the like. But when diversity is viewed as a value to be cherished, then it becomes a part of mission. It becomes a part of the 360 assessment of whether or not we're achieving what we've set out to achieve. It's not something set apart from the overall vision and mission of the business or the institution, right? It's not a philanthropic or charitable gesture, something that a we is doing for another, something that a we can get tired of doing, something that a we could then end up saying, what else do you want, right? And unless we shift the fundamental ground of how we're thinking about diversity, and that goes to the broader question, Drew, of how we think about the nation, because that same notion of the we that troubles businesses troubles the country. Instead of thinking about diversity as constitutive of who we are, we think about diversity as this additive element, something over there when conflict emerges and the like. So I think if companies can get clear on diversity as a value that is at the heart of the success of the business, and so when they do an assessment of whether or not they are achieving mission, hitting their targets with regards to vision and mission, diversity is at the center of the assessment. Now we're doing something much more fundamental. Now we're engaged in the kind of work, the transformative work that will reflect the world in which they actually exist.
Very, very well said. Eddie, it's been fantastic to sit down with you and have this interview. I always like ending on the same question for all these interviews, and you could answer this question in whatever context you want. What advice do you have for young people in 2024?
Oh my God. So young people have had to deal with so much and continue to have to deal with so much. The thing I would say over and over again, Drew, is, think of yourselves in the most expansive of terms. Imagine big. The world as you know it is broken, and you're absolutely right to conclude that it is. And what is required in this moment is an imaginative leap that will throw us all into a different way of being together. So the short version of all of that is think of yourselves in the most expansive of terms, because the world as it is conspires to make you small. And then the question becomes, this is key, if the world conspires to make you small, then the question you must ask yourself every single day is, will you be complicit? Refuse to be small. Take giant steps, like John Coltrane said. Imaginative leaps, and help us bring a new world into being.
As a former jazz musician, I appreciate the Giant Steps reference. Eddie, it was fantastic to sit down with you and have this interview. That is going to conclude our conversation with Dr. Eddie Glaude. Eddie, thank you again for your time. I can't tell you how much I appreciate it.
I appreciate you, Drew. Appreciate you, man. In every way imaginable. You take care of yourself.